was extremely pertinent in that it said, autism doesn't come with a manual, but it comes with a parent that never gives up. And I think that's very evident in both speakers, so thank you very, very much. Last but not least at all, Mr. Diarmuid Heffernan is going to speak to us now. Diarmuid has been working with people on the spectrum for the last 10 years, and he's a colleague of mine in UCC in the Autism Studies course, and he also has, correct me if I'm wrong, ASC, Autism Spectrum Consulting. So he's going to give us our very last presentation, and we'd love you to give him a very, very warm welcome.
Hi, thanks for waiting. This is a real privilege for me. It's a privilege to share the stage with the speakers at the moment, the speakers from this morning. And it's a privilege to get the opportunity to talk to you as well. So thanks very much to Laura and to Shine, to Kieran, to everyone. Thanks very much for asking me to come along. Great. How does this work? Yeah, sorry. Okay, I should have said, I'm actually a very proud Limerick man, standing in City Hall in Cork, even though it's been 2 months. We shouldn't forget it. I'll rely on your, I suppose, indulging me a little bit. You want to know. Okay, so who I am is, that's a list of qualifications and stuff like that. I question why I even included that, but look, who I am is, as Laura mentioned, I've worked with people with autism for 10 years. It's what I'm passionate about. It's my job, but I chose to do it, and I chose to do it because I love it. I love the work I do, I love the one-to-one work I do. Working in UCC is okay, but my real passion is the one-to-one work, so. Just what I think of it as well, the slides are going to be available to everyone, aren't they? Yeah. And what I've tried to do with these slides is I've tried to construct them in a way that, you can go and look at them in your own time as well afterwards, and hopefully they'll still make sense, okay? So I have a couple of books. Completely coincidentally, I have a box with a few copies of one of the books here at an excellent price. We can discuss that later. So ASC, the focus of ASC include positive social interactions, and people with ASD can and should learn from each other and teach neurotypicals. And I guess the 10 years experience I talked about a few minutes ago, that's the 10-year journey I'm on, is learning from the people I work with, learning for families and learning from the people with ASD themselves. So a very quick summary of the senses. I suppose this is maybe a little bit different to some of the things that have been talked about, but I saw an awful lot or heard an awful lot of connections as well from what everyone was saying actually. So there are seven senses: touch, smell, taste, sight, hearing, proprioception, which means this, okay? Being able to touch your elbow while closing your eyes. That's not entirely what proprioception means, that's an example of it. And vestibular, which is more or less around balance. In terms of ASD, the two types of kind of sensory difficulties that are generally spoken about are hyper or hypo. Hypo is undersensitive and hyper is oversensitive to sensory stimuli. There are lots of positives and negatives of sensory differences, and this is my last reference to the book, I promise. I do write about that because, much like some of what has been said already, there's a lot of negativity around autism. When I wrote the book about it, I wanted to actually talk about some of the positives of it as well. So one of the positives of it, and I thought this is pertinent for this week, is people who are hypo or undersensitive to sensory stimuli often have very high pain thresholds. Not always, but often. And one of the suggested professions for people who have that ability is to be an MMA fighter. So I'm retiring Conor McGregor, and I'm looking for the next Irish MMA star. So sensory integration then is the next sort of really important aspect of it. Like when we think about our senses, right, or maybe we don't think about our senses and that's the point, but let's think about them just for a second. Everything that we perceive in our physical environment is through our senses. So our entire understanding of our physical environment, our physical world around us, is through our senses. So when you think about that for a second, with sensory integration, what that does is, it's an orchestra. Think about an orchestra playing, okay? That's our senses working in conjunction with each other to make us function in the world as we find it. In actual fact, our senses mediate our sense of reality, or our sense of what we're experiencing in a given moment as well. In sensory integration, like I say, it's an orchestra. If one instrument is out of tune, if one player had a hard Sunday night and was playing on a Monday morning and was completely out of tune with everyone else, then obviously that's going to create a completely different experience of that orchestra, and it's the same with sensory integration. If one of the senses isn't working quite an orchestra with the others, then it can be a really difficult experience. I just included cyberspaces as alternatives. I mean, I've done quite a bit of research over the last few years around autism, and cyberspaces keep coming up in research as being a way to mediate some of the experiences of autism. In other words, that you go online and that you can make friends online and all those other things. All I'd say about that is that, yes, obviously you don't have the same sensory difficulties. So say, for example, you can be sitting in your comfortable bedroom on your laptop talking to someone at the other side of the world without having to worry about the sensory experiences. However, what are you losing by doing that? And I feel you're losing an awful lot by doing that. I know for some people it's very difficult to actually interact with people face to face, but for me, I think you lose a lot. So the two ways of approaching sensory issues are strategies for coping with the sensory environment, which means the individual themselves adapt to the sensory environment, and strategies for changing the sensory environment, so you adapt the environment around person or people. In this presentation I look at both, but this question should be central to the creation of a plan. Can the environment be adapted, or can the person adapt to their environment? So when I say plan, at the end of this I've got a plan framework. At the end of my presentation here I've got a plan framework. Hopefully we'll have time to go through it. And it just gives people a sense of the kind of things you should look for when you're creating a sensory plan for someone, or if you're creating it for yourself, if you're someone who's on the spectrum. So we're in the midst of the intro, finishing the intro. Sensory issues and anxiety, autism and design, and the plan framework. Sensory issues and anxiety, which I'm just going to come on to now, I think is a very, very important issue. Before I go into sort of some examples and stuff, I wanted to mention a couple of things that I find really interesting and that I hope you do too. And it's about interoception and alexithymia. Have people heard of interoception or alexithymia before? Okay, some people have. So impaired interoception is an impairment of the receptors relaying these signals from body to brain. So basically what interoception is gut feeling. The inherent things that we all, as neurotypicals, take for granted. You know the way you have a feeling about something, you have a feeling about someone, and you don't know exactly what that is. People might call it a feeling, a vibe, whatever, in the situation or about other people. Even if you're walking along a street, maybe at night time, and even though there's no one else around, you have a feeling. You have a gut feeling that's telling you, okay, I know it's dark and it's nighttime, but I also feel like maybe there's some danger, I need to get out of here. So for a lot of people with ASD, or for many people with ASD, they don't have that. They don't have what an awful lot of neurotypicals take for granted, which is a gut feeling or an inherent sense of understanding the world. And this may also impair the person's ability to recognize emotions, due, for example, to the inability to recognize symptoms of stress. For example, racing heart or sweating. Like, there's a few people I've worked with over the years with Asperger's syndrome, and I've got one friend in particular with Asperger's syndrome, where I would have said, do you feel anxious at the moment? You're about to do something that usually causes you anxiety. Do you feel anxious? Nope. No anxiety at all. Has anyone ever had that experience with your children or someone with ASD where you say, how are you feeling? And oftentimes, they don't know. They find it really, really hard to answer that question, okay? And that's about this. That's about what we're talking about here, not recognizing your own sort of internal signals. Emotional signals, for example, mood, are not perceived and not integrated into our decision-making, which is called alexithymia. Difficulties having an inherent core sense of the world, as I said already, gut feeling, can lead to the creation of rules which are abided by to the detriment of the person. And I know black and white thinking came up already in a slightly different context, But this is another definite issue, that literal thinking, stemming from this. And I know it's a slightly different way of looking at things. It's a slightly different way of looking at why someone might think so literally, but it's just one to bear in mind. Strategies for dealing with interoceptive difficulties involve OT input. That generally involves vestibular alerting or calming exercises. I'm not going to go into that now, I'm not an OT, so. Sensory issues and anxiety. So around 50% of young people who were surveyed in this data score above normative levels for social anxiety. An intolerance of uncertainty, or hypo and hyper, as we've discussed already, sensitivities, have been found to be associated with anxiety symptoms, and these may encourage avoidance of social situations. Negative experiences with sensory stimuli could lead to avoidance, which is relevant when considering the role that anxiety could play. This particular couple of slides I had coming up are from a study I thought a particularly interesting study. Now, the slides I've included, right, I've highlighted the bits that are to do with sensory, but I've left other pieces in there because, again, I thought they might be useful to you in general, okay? So, you can see the highlighted ones there: sound and light sensitivities, crowds, unexpected or sudden change, and life transitions, for example, leaving school. I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but you can see them there yourselves. So what do you do? Well, accurate identification of possible anxiety-provoking situations, signs and symptoms, as well as potential predisposing and preventative factors would be pertinent to the development and implementation of effective coping strategies for this population. Okay, so what that means is... Now, I should just mention that the two slides, the causes of anxiety and the strategies for coping with anxiety, all came from people with ASD themselves. And that's what I particularly liked about this piece of research. That doesn't always happen. Okay, right. So the second part, as I mentioned in my intro, the second thing that I feel is really, really important is autism and design. So when I talked about the two approaches to sensory differences in autism, I said that the person adapts, or the environment can be adapted, or hopefully can be adapted. This is about the environment and whether it can be adapted. So why design? Well, to create a physical environment that reflects the sensory needs of people with ASD. Universal design. If you're familiar with universal design, that's the idea that physical spaces or public spaces should be accessible for everyone, particularly around physical disabilities. To me, the missing sort of component of that is sensory differences or sensory difficulties. Because then, if that's not included, you can't call it universal, can you? Because there's an awful lot of people who do find those spaces very, very difficult and are excluded because of their sensory differences. Some of the examples of where this design has come into fruition is Shannon Airport. Has anyone seen the sensory room in Shannon Airport? Yeah, I went into it. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I wanted to see it, and I thought it was amazing, personally. I thought it was amazing. I really liked it. Of course, there's always more you can do, but like in a public space like that, I think, it's not bad. Just to give an example, again, by the way, of why I think universal design is so important. If it wasn't so important, and to include people with sensory differences, then we wouldn't need autism-friendly shopping, we wouldn't need autism-friendly cinema, etc. Now, this is something that's spreading. As you probably know, Clonakilty has just become an autism-friendly town. There's autism-friendly cinema days and shopping days, and yeah, there's loads of stuff. It's been brilliant, and that is an acknowledgement and a recognition of some of the things I'm talking about here. It can also include a person's home space or workspace, if possible. And really what you're talking about there is designing or creating a home space that's reflective of your own needs. I feel that sensory differences or difficulties. It creates continuity and certainty and aids transitions, really between rooms, between spaces. What's the purpose of rooms? We'll talk about that again. So design guidelines, where to live. For example, a safe area, good quality housing, close to amenities, far from unwanted noises. Don't live in Limerick would be the first thing. Don't live next door to Reardon's, probably not a great idea either. But these are the kind of things to be taken into consideration. Say, for example, particularly if someone was going to be moving to college or moving out of the home in any way, shape or form. Layout of the abode, your own space. Where is the bedroom in relation to other rooms? Practicalities. So you don't want the bedroom to be next door to the particularly noisy rooms in the house, like the kitchen and the living room. So I was going to make a joke about the bathroom, but I'm not going to, about that being noisy rooms. Visual cues, to create a map of markers from one space to another, which is the function of each space. Like I find that a really interesting one. These couple of slides are based on Sherry and Aronson, who are a couple of architects, I believe, who came up with some of these, what would it come, headlines and frameworks for creating design for people with autism. And it's fascinating. The idea of the transitions between spaces is one that I find particularly interesting. In other words, that you can colour code things would probably be the easiest way. And that, the different colours are representative of the different functions in different rooms. Now, you don't have to do that all over the house, obviously. There's certain places that might be more relevant than others. That can even be relevant within someone's own room. The ventilation, getting enough air into the space. I mean, one of the people I work with is employed in a very, very busy open plan office. And this is a huge issue for her, absolutely massive issue for her. She feels incredibly uncomfortable an awful lot of the time. And obviously it's very difficult to be asking to go out every 5 minutes then as well. Lighting, types of light bulb. Some lighting, sometimes you feel you're being interrogated by the Gestapo when you walk into a building, which probably doesn't do a lot of people with autism any favours. In terms of the fluorescent, I mean, that's to do with acoustics really as much as anything else. There's a low frequency hum that you're probably all familiar with that comes from fluorescent lighting, and many people with autism really struggle with that. Appliances, and again, noise-wise, they can be set by timer when you're not there and stuff like that. So some practical examples. In the home, it would be physically dividing up home spaces. So, I mean, the kind of things you could do there, like an office, for example, or if you have the space in the house, a room that someone can go to. I mean, obviously most of the time kids or teenagers will go to their bedrooms, but there's other rooms maybe that could be used, repurposed maybe in the house. Dividing by time. Now this was one I found very, very interesting because there's someone I know with Asperger's syndrome who says that the house is a contested space essentially from a sensory point of view because there's kids and there's other people sharing that space, and all the noises and all the other things associated with that are very difficult for him. So basically he divides the house up by time. As soon as his wife and all the kids are gone to school, the house is his, and he can, there's no noises, nothing happens in there that he doesn't have control over. So that's another way of dividing it. So a better sensory environment, where the room is located in the house, as we discussed already, the transitions between rooms and the colour coding. In school, which is the first public space, I suppose, that young people come into contact with. It's the first big public space. I think in secondary school in particular, like my experience has been that the transition from primary school to secondary school is a very important transition. And if it's done well, that can really set someone on the right road in secondary school. But preemptive work, like I'm always a big believer as much as possible in preemptive work anyway around autism. You don't want to be in the middle of a crisis or a meltdown or any of these other things if you can help it. I mean, obviously you can't always control it, but if there's preemptive work that you can do. So knowledge of the school environment, especially the public spaces of school. Unfortunately, over the years, and I'm sure maybe a lot of us have had these experiences, like there's been a couple of people I've worked with who spent their entire secondary school breaks in the toilet. There's one person in particular that spent those 5 or 6 years, I don't know if they did transition year or not, but those 5 or 6 years, every single break time in the toilets. And the main reason for that was the corridors, the noises, the crowds, the smells, everything that's associated with lots of people in a small space, basically. So the plan should be a collaboration with the school, teachers and parents. Collaboration comes up again, and I'll probably emphasise it more than I just think that's very, very important. The school uniform. School uniforms are horrible most of the time. They're itchy and horrible, and I think there's a lot of people with autism who would really struggle with the material. So you'll need to adapt that, obviously, before you go to a particular school. I know this might sound like a small thing, but like if your daughter or son is going to be going to school already anxious, already stressed, and this on top of it as well, I don't think it's going to do them any favours. Sensory breaks, break cards, preemptive sensory breaks, and back again to what I said, a lot of the time I've found over the years in schools, sensory breaks are understood to be when a child is ready to like explode, well, you better have a break now, and the teacher decides that maybe, or whatever, and like the stresses and anxiety the kid might have about like standing out amongst everyone in the class, well, like when that happens, then they definitely are going to. So I'm a big believer in preemptive breaks. If you create a structure where someone has a card system, for example, or an agreement with the school and with the teachers, then it should never be an issue. They can go out, take these breaks before they get to the point of becoming overwhelmed. The placement in the classroom, so some people I work with prefer to be just inside the door. And in actual fact, a few people I know with autism would say that, like one person in particular, when he goes shopping, the first thing he looks at is the exit. How the hell do I get back out of here again if I have to? Reverse quickly. And so for a lot of people at school, in classrooms as well, it would be about sitting near the door. It's a psychological thing, and I can understand it completely. So teachers' awareness. Is there many teachers here? I'll definitely get away with it, so. I'm joking. No, I think it's just, it's very, it's a lottery, essentially. It's a lottery. There's teachers, clearly you're the best, most interested teachers because you're here. That's the ones who aren't here that we should worry about. But no, I think it's very variable. It's very, very variable from school to school, and even to some extent from county to county. That's certainly been my experience, and I'd say the experience of most people who work with people with autism. But teachers need to be aware. School environment, lights, sound, etc., and the supports available in the school. I think that's a really important one. I think again it's very, very variable in terms of the quality or standard of the people that are in the school. But with the right supports, it can be great. It can make a really big difference. So in other words, if someone is becoming overwhelmed on a given day, that there's some safe space in the school that they can go to, and a person that they can actually have a conversation with as well. I think that's very important. The idea that there's sensory rooms in every school, obviously we know there isn't. Okay, college, a lot of the same things, but like some of the sort of differences might be picking the right course. For example, like would the course you have, or that you're going to do, have labs or technical work involved in it? Because obviously there's sensory sort of potential in that. The preemptive knowledge of the college. The place I'm most familiar with would be UCC, and certainly with the people I work with who are intending on going to UCC. I go around campus, get people used to it, know what to expect, this is the preemptive work again, know what to expect. Even go to the lecture halls if you can. If people are familiar with UCC, the Boole lecture halls that are kind of down in the basement have 200 or 300. They're enormous, and I think just even for people to have a sense of that first before you actually go to the college, so you're not, again, overwhelmed by it. Lecturer awareness, where are we now? How to get to college and implications of this, for example, public transport. An awful lot of the people I work with hate buses, and a lot of that is to do with being on display. It's that sense that when you walk onto the bus that people are looking at you. Judging you, or people might have, ill intent towards you, and I find that very common with the people I work with, that they're really, 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 ultra aware of the people around them and, what their intentions might be, etc. So knowing, what public transport you can getting used to it if you need to, or if there's alternatives is very important. Lecturer awareness. Well, UCC have just appointed an awareness ambassador is the word I'm going to use, but basically a person who's going to raise awareness around autism on UCC campus, which I think is great. Sensory breaks again, obviously in college a person has to actually look after that themselves. Public spaces, for example, the library, what that's like, the different components of that. Disclosure to the college, and if you're going to disclose to the college what support services might actually come from that. Okay. In terms of work, picking the right work environment. So obviously, if you are sensitive towards noises. Probably getting a job driving a jackhammer wouldn't be the best job for you. So, picking the right work environment is very important. The job interview, I mean, I could do a whole piece about the job interview. I'm not going to, obviously, but how you dress, how you get there, the public transport, all that stuff. Disclosure, I think, again, is a really, really important one. I'd actually say disclosure in terms of people with autism who are trying to get into the workplace is probably the most important thing. I'm not imposing on someone whether they should actually disclose or not, but I do feel the more people that do, the higher the critical mass, the more awareness there is, the better, So I found, like, over the last year alone, 2 of the people I've worked with have disclosed to their employers, and in both cases they got very, very, very positive responses to it. Now, that's anecdotal, but still, at the same time, it was very heartening. So, how to get to work, sensory breaks, comfortable, appropriate clothing, a divided workspace, and headphones. The headphones one's a really, really big one again. Again, there's someone else I work with in an open plan office, and she describes one of her colleagues as foghorn leghorn. And basically what she means is that he's incredibly loud, and that she just literally cannot concentrate on a thing while this person's talking. And it's a real issue, because you can't say, shut up, you can't do that, not in the workplace. So all she can do is, at times, use her headphones, So, again, small things, but very, very important, I think, anyway. Okay, so in terms of drawing all this together into a plan, like a framework. So I mentioned the collaboration and how important that is. I just can't stress enough how important it is that it should be a collaboration between the different people who are involved, wherever the person might be that school, college work, wherever. It's just vital. And the person-centered approach should be followed and tailored to each individual's needs. Okay. That's very, very important as well. Basically, person-centered approach, we're just saying that whoever the person is with ASD, they should be involved in all of this. In fact, they should be at the centre of it, okay? So guidelines for a sensory plan. The history or experience, building a profile. So what has the person's experience been with public and private spaces in the past? For example, school, college, work, private spaces, shared spaces, relationships, and memories associated with spaces. That's very important. It's very important to have a profile of the kinds of experiences, because again, you can start getting into preemptive stuff. Anxiety and sensory issues. So sources of anxiety, internal, sights, sounds, smells, taste, or the external ones. Crowds, classrooms, lecture halls, workplaces, and public transport. The transitions between spaces. The design, what can be done to aid the sensory needs of the individual in different spaces? For example, school environment, college, work, shared spaces. Is it possible to actually change the environment slightly, adapt it even just a small bit to actually suit the person better? The context, school. So you look at the challenges, and we've actually looked at some of the challenges already that people might face in the classroom. And what can you do about them? What strategies can be put in place? What adaptations can the school make? What kind of things can they do to make the classroom and the school space less stressful? So college, what are the sensory challenges of college? Lecture halls, libraries, corridors, labs, restaurant, lunch halls, school environments, public transport and travel. Like in that case, I would say that like if the person is okay with disclosing to the college, then access the supports that the college has and enter the college through that route. What most disability officers do in colleges now is they actually they bring people in a little bit early, particularly people with ASD, to get used to the environment. And I'm finding they're getting better and better at that actually over the last while. So I think that's a great thing. So work, again, individual workspaces, sensory issues associated with the type of work, radios, canteens, corridors, foghorn leghorn, social spaces, public transport and travel. I just threw in foghorn leghorn there, obviously. He's not everywhere. Look back over what has worked and what hasn't, and tailor the strategies as necessary. The review part is really, really important. Can I just say about this, right? Like, what I'm trying to describe for everyone here is a plan or a framework that everyone can use. Do you know what I mean? Like, so for example, occupational therapists will have their sensory profile. They'll have their own measurement devices. What I'm suggesting to you is that this is something that you can do yourselves for your children, or if you're on the spectrum, you can do it for yourself. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get across here. Is just something simple, straightforward, but at the same time you can follow it, and it's actually going to be really, really useful to you. So the limits of a plan. Each person will experience spaces differently depending on how they're feeling and the level of anxiety, and that's a really interesting one. I was at a conference last year, or the year before. It was an autism conference, but it was a quiet one. Now there might have been some people that were at that. It was an ASIM conference, and one of the speakers. Sorry, I should just say no one could clap because of the potential sensory problems there. So everyone went like this, which when 2,000 people were doing looked really cool, I have to say. Just going down. So that's what people were doing. But one of the speakers, a guy called Peter Vermeulen, came on stage and said, no, I'm not having people waving at me. We're going to do the clapping thing. But what we're going to do is, I'm going to tell you when we're going to do it. So we're going to do a countdown. I'm going to prepare you, and then we'll clap. And we'll see if anyone leaves, and no one did. Preemptive, people were expecting it. It makes an enormous difference. So disclosure, again, I think I've talked about disclosure enough. I just think it can be very, very important in particular situations, particularly I would say work and college. It's not always possible to create a good sensory space, for example, workplaces, etc. As we talked about already, there's some people who one of the other issues that person who works with the loud guy has is people eating packets of crisps around her. And I know, again, you can't ban them, but I'm just saying, you don't think of these things. You just don't generally think of these things, that someone might be sitting there and really struggling. Now, obviously, it's really crunchy package and all that kind of stuff. It's going to make me hungry now. I did have a late lunch though. There's a lot of sensory aspects to that. There's the noise and the smell. It's not always possible to create a good sensory space, for example, workspaces, sorry I said that. It will not necessarily change others' awareness, and that's a really, really important thing. See, this is why I love days like today, is that this is raising awareness. This is fantastic. And the more of these, at these kinds of days, the better, basically. The more awareness people have, the better. So in conclusion, even small changes can make a big difference. Okay? So I hope you've taken some small things out of what I've said today. And if not, I know, as was suggested earlier on, I got the graveyard shift, and I know people's ability to memorize stuff. So again, you can always refer back to it anyway, to the slides and stuff like that. And thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Diarmuid. I think with sensory difficulties,